So the topic for today is AE Perspectives for Investing in Resilience. As I mentioned, our guest speaker is Joyce Coffey, who's a lead AP. So next slide, please. Just a very quick introduction for Joyce. She's, I'll wait till the slide shifts here. Oops, a little too far. Go back a little bit, thank you. Joyce works for the Institute for Building Technology and Safety, IBTS, for those that know that organization. And she's also the president of Climate Resilience Consulting. She has her own practice in addition to that, where she's providing support and consulting to others. An accomplished professional with a lot of experience, 25 years working both domestically and internationally, private sector, public sector, really has focused on sustainability, resilience strategies, management, performance measurements, all the things that really affect our communities and infrastructure. And she's really got some great ideas that we're looking forward to hearing. Her credentials are wonderful and significant, so I'm not going to get into those, and you can certainly see those at a later point. So with that, Joyce, I think I'll turn over to you and let you take over from here.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Albert, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of your COI discussion today. I'm really thrilled for the chance to speak with engineers about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is really putting your marvelous solutions and practical applications and innovation into practice. And I'm just going to let you know that I don't actually have control. Oh, there we go. So, today we're going to think a little bit more about how we can actually move your engineering into spade in the ground efforts for building resilience. And of course, this is needed more than ever. Losses due to weather-related events have increased nearly tenfold over the last 40 years, from a 10-year global average of $12 billion in 1980 to $119 billion today. And in order to combat spiraling losses from climate impacts, an estimated $200 billion is needed globally annually within the next 20 years to really build resilience. So what does that look like? Well, I always like to start with a storm that many of us are familiar with, Hurricane Sandy. And in Hurricane Sandy, we see the beacon of light near this red dot on our screen. That is Goldman Sachs. They stayed open throughout the storm with their lights on because they had a few extra feet of sandbags. But the bottom line was that the engineering around them, underneath them, and above them did not survive the storm. And so while they were in fact open, they were not able to operate well. And that is not resilience. So we're working to think about how might we build resilience for, let's say, Lower Manhattan. And they come up with something that makes the front page of yet another journal, the Rolling Stones, for the Big U. This is Mayor Bloomberg's idea to essentially provide some sort of a sea barrier all around the lower tip of Manhattan. But with the new mayor, there's yet another new climate proofing technology and set of initiatives that come forward and are front page news. But the center of each one of these two resilient solutions is really, where's the money? And in fact, when you look carefully at what is happening in each of those cases, it's not yet clear. So we're going to talk a little bit about where that kind of money might come from. But just a reminder, we probably don't need it for this group since you're all very aware of how disasters affect our work, and you're so focused on mitigation. But the number of billion-dollar disasters is growing pretty much every year, and it's gained notice amongst many who approve our projects. So the World Economic Forum every year does a global risk perception survey of what they call the educated elite around the globe. And for the last several years, extreme weather has been not only the most likely, but also the most readily impactful risk amongst these educated elite. Of course, even besides extreme weather, the failure of climate change mitigation and natural disasters also make the top 5 and have for a while. So when we think about resilience and how we're going to decrease the both need for resilience and the impact of risks, of course, we understand that one of the major ways to do that is to decrease the concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We haven't so far been very successful at that, so we continue along the pace of a regional concentration pathway that is cresting into the 8.5 area, which would be, a very significant increase in temperature in most parts of the world that would result in more and more need for resilience. But even if we do really do a fantastic job with our engineering and our finance and bring mitigation into a stronger and stronger position, mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, we still need mitigation of risks. So I want to speak a little bit about some of the market inspirations for resilience, because I know many of us on the phone have worked very actively with federal funding for risk mitigation, for resilience, for new builds. And so we may know that world very well. But as I mentioned in my upfront, it won't just be sovereign money, federal money, that will help to build resilience. We also need money from the marketplace. And it turns out that that money should be more and more available, perhaps due to the 5 reasons that I present here. Number one is that it's becoming clearer and clearer through case and constitutional law that many of us have a growing liability due to climate risks. So real estate professionals, urban planners, local government officials, and engineers have all been implicated in cases that have put climate risk at the fore. It's no longer a fair claim in the court of law to say that it was an act of God or force majeure, because we have the data to show that climate risk is here and growing. Secondly, insurance costs are growing in some places. Now, not very quickly, but certainly in places that have had extreme sea level or especially coastal risks occur, like Houston and Miami, the cost of insurance for private sector players is growing, and that cost, of course, can be brought down through mitigation and resilience. Third, both the private sector and the public sector are now being examined from the perspective of bond ratings, whether or not they have physical impact from climate change. So Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and more Fitch, but the first 2 are really the leaders here, have said that municipalities, utilities, and the corporate sector, when they float bonds, those bonds will be reviewed from the perspective of whether or not they have A, assessed their risk from climate impacts, and B, addressed those risks. Fourth, big data is here, thank goodness, because I think it's improved certainly engineering and many other professions. And with big data, we can tell a lot more about how to account for avoided loss. So we can essentially determine through catastrophe modeling what the investment in infrastructure improvements will bring in terms of not having to pay out in the future for a disaster. And fifth, these 2 gentlemen in the center here, this is of course Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney. Mark is the head of the Bank of England, and together these 2 folks led the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, otherwise known as TCFD, which created guidelines, not rules or law, but guidelines to invite investors to look at not only what had previously been part of the investment portfolio, like do you have carbon in your portfolio? And not only what we had then seen happening more and more in the marketplace, are you ready to transition to renewable energy for your investments? But now, very specifically, have you looked at all of your investments from the perspective of whether or not they have physical impacts from climate change? So TCFD has been out for about 2 years, and over 800 investment firms have already made strides to follow its guidelines. And I'm not going to focus too much here, except I did put in this extra slide about TCFD because as leaders in major infrastructure projects, all of you probably in some way or another touch those investors who have actually already followed the guidelines, like Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, or the Bank of England and other major funders. And so it's important for you to be able to tell your entire project what you're doing to manage these physical risks, acute and chronic, in your project, because that will help investors to feel much more confident that they should in fact be flooding more money into your work. So in a sense, I'm trying to suggest that this is a real benefit to you, that the TCFD exists, because it allows you to celebrate the work that you do every day to mitigate risk in order to pull more finance in addition to funding, which is, more, when I say funding, I mean, although it's defined differently by other people, funding being that comes from grants from governments or philanthropy versus financing that which comes from debt or equity. So I do want to remind us that in every one of our projects, in order to build resilience, we have 3 options, maybe more, but the 3 that I think are very simple and classic whenever we're evaluating at that 0% complete of our project is we can adapt to the changes that are here and are coming. We can prepare for them with better and more resilient and perhaps even more expensive engineering, or we can retreat from them. We can actually change where the project is located so that we have less and less risk. And it's interesting to see that in the, I just took 4 of the environments in the United States where you've had some fairly extreme events happen, retreat is not really coming up as an option yet. So it really suggests to me, when I look at these data, that engineers are at the forefront, on the vanguard of assuring that our communities can both adapt and prepare to climate risk through your building of resilience. And that's, I feel very hopeful about that, and really inspired by the work that all of you do to build that resilience. But of course, we know that not everyone in the United States responds to hazards in the same way. In other words, there's a difference in vulnerability, even within a community. And these data, just to go around in clockwise rotation, the first comes from Zwillow, and it shows the number of homes that will be underwater by the end of the century if we continue at the RCP 8.5 that I showed at the beginning of my presentation. That is what would create essentially an average of a 6 feet sea level rise. And then to the right, we see that there are many places that will both be seeing a decrease in population, as well as some that will see an increase in population due to people retreating, moving away from risk, either because of a catastrophic event or even because they are anticipating such a thing. And then to the lower right here, we see the social vulnerabilities being very different for different populations in the United States. And that's further described on the source on the lower left-hand corner, which was a really interesting science journal report that came out in 2017 and was profiled in the Washington Post, New York Times, and elsewhere, that essentially showed that we are probably going to see a decrease in the GDP of counties that have higher vulnerability due to lower resources. So even though the hazards may be the same, the vulnerability may be greater, and there will be an impact on GDP due to that. So, just as professionals who are mission driven, we might ask ourselves how to avoid the impact that relative vulnerability creates beyond the impact of hazards. Here's an example of what I mean. Already in Buras, Louisiana, which is well south of New Orleans, they've seen 67% of their population leave after Hurricane Katrina. And many of those people left because, not because they were paid to do so, for instance, with a FEMA buyout or a HUD buyout, but because they simply had nothing left. The community was really tanking. And in fact, in the beginning of the process post-Katrina to figure out how to build resilience there, many of them asked for engineered solutions like building levees. I did want to mention that now, after a lot of work to determine what would in fact build resilience for their communities, they're focusing a lot more on social engineering. They need a safe harbor for their boats, and they need more mental health facilities. So just a way to sort of think about what our work means. Not all of it, building resilience, will be about the hard infrastructure, but of course much of it will. And so how do we pay for that hard infrastructure? Well, here's a very interesting case. In the city of Miami Beach, where they have yet to receive FEMA or HUD money in the last decade, they have built over $600 million in infrastructure improvements or infrastructure resilience with essentially ratepayer and taxpayer funds. And they did this by establishing a sewer fee, which they had not had before. In the past, like many of us, our jurisdictions combine our water and sewer fees. So they established that as a separate fee, and then over the course of a decade, they raised that fee 3 times. And that allowed them to create a kitty of funds that they could then leverage with debt, that is revenue bonds, from the private markets. As they began to do more and more of this, they actually also found that their population was pleased, because in part the engineering was great. The engineering actually meant that fewer and fewer people had wet feet during king tides. And in addition to things like elevating roads and establishing a pumping infrastructure, they were also seeing benefits like, new lighting and other infrastructure improvements that were very present. So there were these collateral benefits. So over time, the city of Miami Beach just last year was able to actually raise their taxes specifically for resilience. So I think that's a really important story for all of us who work in communities for long periods of time, or who may be working right now with communities who are perhaps at the early stages of trying to address how they're going to finance and fund their resilience over and above that what they get from the federal government. So in the end, though, I think it's important to remember, I'm sure that those of us on the phone here are sitting in many different places than those that I've just profiled, but all of us are paying for the need to mitigate risks, the need to build resilience, because the National Flood Insurance Program and many of the other incredible assets of the federal government that help us to recover post-event, in fact, come out of our taxpayers' dollars. So this is something that I think when we think about the very giant firms that many of you work for, we all need to appreciate that we're all in this to build resilience, not just along the coast, but for all of our benefits as residents and citizens of the United States. And of course, it really helps to build our safety, security, and stability, which are 3 words that I use in place of resilience and many times when I'm speaking with clients. And I use resilience with all of you because your COI is called resilience, but I'm sure you also use those other words at times as well. So I wanted to just, as I pivot to about the midway of my presentation, or closer to the end here, talk about some other types of finance over and above federal funding. Primarily, the bonding mechanism is a really key way for us to grow infrastructure resilience. And I think most of you are familiar with the gold standard of bonding, which is the GO bond, which I put in the very center of this slide, because wouldn't it be fantastic if every one of your projects that's funded through a general obligation bond actually had the requirement for resilience built into it, which would mean that the money that resilience sometimes requires over and above the mainstream of your work would be funded or financed. So, in fact, some cities or corporations are getting more savvy about ensuring that all of their capital improvement projects that are paid for with their GO bonds do in fact include resilience. And there are some projects that may not be funded by the GO bond, but have other means of financing, such as that coming from the green bond community, which I'll tell you a little bit more in a moment, the environmental impact bond, which very likely some of you have worked with, where essentially not only do bond holders, the investors, get their money back, but they also get the benefit of seeing some sort of environmental or social impact achieved, like a green space created, or a tourism amenity created, or a certain number of people with better access to those things. There are, in fact, even now in the lower right-hand corner of the slide here, new means of funding and financing that come from the insurance sector, such as resilience bonds, which are essentially bonds that wrap around an insurance product so that you, as the investor, infrastructure engineer of record, are protected in the event that the project that you're working on that's funded by this resilience bond has a catastrophe befall it during the phase of construction or immediately after. So these are new and I think very important means of finance that actually capitalize on the fact that municipal governments in particular in the United States have tax-free bonding capacities, because that would mean that the insurance on the in-construction project would also be tax-free. So let's think a little bit more about the tool of the climate bond Just disclosure that I work for the Climate Bonds Initiative, which is based in the UK, and they're the only enterprise in the world that certifies quote unquote green bonds. And for the longest time, they've only dealt with green bonds that relate to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. But now, hopefully music to your ears as members of your resilient COI, they're going to be also evaluating bonds based upon climate resilience principles. And so these principles, I think, are really interesting for all of us to examine for two reasons. One, of course, maybe your client is interested in getting more funding from a certain sector of investor, the green bond investor, who wants to grow his portfolio. So this could be a new way to finance your project, because these funds will now hopefully flood more money into resilience-related projects. But two, frankly, I think that the principles are a very good roadmap for all of us to use as sort of the litmus test on a napkin to determine whether or not we are in fact building resilience. Because what they essentially ask is that every bond that goes through the green bond certification process does three things. Number one, it mitigates the physical risks, which we define as hazards, vulnerabilities, and exposure of climate change. So it has to both assess those risks and then mitigate for them. Two, it needs to bring resilience benefits over and above just addressing those risks. So for instance, it might be that it's a wastewater treatment, so it's a water treatment facility that is creating potable water. And in order to address the risk of climate change, it's going to have to deal with more and more brackish water because it's somewhat near the coast, or it's in a limestone related area. So in order to turn that water sweeter, it's going to need to be addressing that risk with slightly different technologies. And the co-benefit, that is the resilience benefit over and above just addressing those risks, is that it will be providing water in places that will maybe be experiencing growing drought over time due to, or growing water insecurity due to changes in climate. So that would be the second really key thing. And then the third is that these projects do no significant harm. And there really is two ways to think about harm. One of course, is that we don't want our projects necessarily to be hugely impactful on greenhouse gas emissions in their operation. So we want to be building more and more efficiency using all of our infrastructure innovation to ensure that we decrease our greenhouse gas emissions footprint in our project. But two, we also want to be sure that whatever we're building is building something that brings benefits to all. So I mentioned earlier the tale of several cities. That is, some are going to be facing greater vulnerability even as they have the same hazards. So we want to be sure that the levee, at the end of the levee, doesn't mean an inundation of greater force to the poorer community that may be at the caboose of the levee's end, as one example. So that's, I think, a really key part of our mission-driven work here to build resilience for Americans. A second area I wanted to be sure we focused on when I mentioned that one of the real assets that we had at our disposal now was big data. We also have a lot more ways to measure climate risk at the parcel scale, at the scale that you work on, right? I think many of us think about these climate data as being very ethereal. It's like, here's what the state's climate problems are going to be, or even what the cities, or even what a community's climate resilience. But that means nothing if you actually have to work on your engineered drawings. So I wanted to just bring to mind that more and more in both the boutique consulting community, like the Climate Service, but also somewhat free if you're a super wizard using various modalities of data and granular downscaling, we are able to produce information that shows what various climate change scenarios will mean in terms of risks at the parcel scale. And this is extremely important, I think, for doing resilient engineering projects and infrastructure projects. So I'm really heartened that this is in fact happening. And as I wrap here, I wanted to also mention that although I focused earlier on the question of insurance as it relates to resilience bonds, there also is a new means of ensuring infrastructure investments over and above the indemnity insurance that all of us are familiar with. Indemnity insurance, of course, is our house insurance, our car insurance, and many of our cities have indemnity insurance. Essentially, what this is you've got to submit your claim and have an assessor come out. Many of you probably have done assessments like this and been paid for them. and then eventually you get your payout. In the case of parametric insurance, parametric, like it sounds, by the measure, this is insurance that is defined by the trigger of a particular index, a particular measure, like a flood gauge being triggered, or the number of days over a certain temperature in a row, or the lack of rain, certain number of days in a row or weeks in a row. So regardless of whether or not you have had an impact, or your project has had an impact, if the trigger is, the index is triggered, you receive your payout within about 2 weeks. Excuse me, I'm suffering from a cold. So thank you all so much, and while I recover my voice, I hope that you will share your questions. And Albert, over to you for facilitating that.
Thank you, Joyce. Really excellent presentation and some great topics you mentioned. There are a couple of questions that have come in, so I'll start with one that was received, and I'll just read it verbatim. Some of the costs of the disaster stem from audacious decisions made by code officials years prior to a storm. Thus, is it fair to say that insurance costs are rising that stem from bad decisions that allowed someone to build where no one should be building? What are your thoughts on that, Joyce?
This is just a fantastic question. The bottom line is that engineering can be as formidable and wonderful as it is, but if we do not make good land use choices, and if our policies allow us to continue to make really incorrect decisions, uninformed decisions, I guess I should say, we are going to be doing a huge disservice to our infrastructure and to the people who rely upon it. So I think this is a really important point, that all of resilience starts with better policy. Some of that policy relates to finance, some of it relates to land use, some of it relates to retreat. But adapt, prepare, retreat, at the overarching umbrella of that trifecta is in fact better policy. The bottom line is, though, that many of our policies have put humans in harm's way. In the United States, for instance, the vast majority of our public housing is in a floodplain. It's remarkable. And I'm not talking about coastal floodplains even. I'm talking about river floodplains. And of course, we know that moving lower income populations creates a lot of NIMBY, not in my backyard. So many communities are really struggling with policies in the past that allowed them to, and in fact, in some cases required them to put lower and middle income populations in harm's way. And those harms are now growing dramatically. So I think the answer to your question is yes, and it's an excellent point. And you as engineers have the opportunity to be, frankly, one of the most trusted advisors of any kind of sector, certainly much more trusted than most policymakers, to help raise this point over and over again to your stakeholders. Because I think when you do, people listen, much just like we listen to our physicians, we listen to our engineers. So I'm glad that you're raising it, not me, because I think it helps to really make this a much more realistic and trusted concept for all of us to move forward on. We must change policy in order to protect lives and livelihoods and the built form.
Thank you, Joyce. And I think to add to that, from my experience, it's important that we do get engaged with policymakers, with decision makers, so that we're able to advise them well before a community has to deal with the consequences of those decisions. So visibility by the engineering community within those decision makers is critical to accomplish that goal. So thank you for that response. Sort of mitigation investments and things of that nature can help hopefully mitigate and address some of those decisions that could be better for the future. A related point to that, when we look at the future, one of the questions really that comes up is, so how do you account for resilience from a cost-benefit standpoint? A lot of times projects don't always work out that way, that you could show the numbers perfectly, and quantitatively it may not be the easiest thing to do. So is there a way to deal with it from a cost-benefit analysis? And some of the funding mechanisms you mentioned, how do they impact some of those cost-benefit analyses that are done often with these kinds of projects?
Yeah, great question. Well, I mean, I think all of us know that each of our clients has a different requirement for CBA. FEMA has one requirement, HUD has another, and I'm sure that in your shop you have different formulas and models that you use for your CBA. But what I would say is best practice around resilience within all of those models is that we ask the question of avoided loss. We have to begin to allow for our CVAs to be beyond 2 years, beyond 5 years even, maybe to the 10-year realm, to show that by increasing the flexibility and robustness of this infrastructure project, which may in fact cause an increase in cost, we will be over time saving the ultimate owner of this infrastructure X dollars. Now, I understand that in the capital stack of many projects, this doesn't really work out because the owner of the infrastructure may not be involved in the initial investment. So I would say that number one, it's always great to work on projects where the owner is involved in the initial investment for a whole variety of reasons, including that I think you get a much better outcome. But number two, we need to be focusing, if one of the keys of cost benefit analysis for resilience is that we look at avoided losses, the other is that we expand the number of rows on our Excel spreadsheet for CBA to include some collateral benefits, because many of those collateral benefits bring actually quantified benefit today to communities who will also be protected in the future by mitigating future risks. And I do mean here, like for instance, an increase in tourism or visits, or a decrease in air pollution or asthma, or other things that could be actually quantified, that had typically, I think, been understood outside of the infrastructure realm. Like when I used to work for a big engineering firm, when I would bring those things up, they were like, well, those are social questions. They really don't fit here in our physical infrastructure spreadsheet. But I think that more and more we can find quantifications for those social benefits in terms of tax revenue, in terms of ratepayers, in terms of, essentially more money flowing into communities that we can actually put into our project pro forma.
Thank you, Joyce. I think we're going to probably wrap it up at this point then with your portion of the presentation. But we do have on the screen here your contact information. So if anyone would like to follow up with Joyce and ask any questions, certainly some great topics that she touched on and discussed. And there's also the book that she has published, certainly worth getting that. So I want to thank you very much, Joyce, and great presentation, and hopefully we'll have some more follow-up, and as you can share more of what you're learning in terms of what's happening in this particular arena for us. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Albert. I appreciate the opportunity.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks very much.
We appreciate it as well. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk, to share some information from our Hampton Roads post. Ben Ream is the person who'll be speaking to us about this, and Ben has been serving with the post for the past 8 years. He has 13 years of experience working with Kimley Horn. Those of you that know that organization, transportation engineering is his background, and he's been active with the post as committee chair for EP&IR, also as treasurer, and he was one of the lead individuals who helped the post submit for the resilience streamer and earn the distinction they did. So we asked Ben to share with us some of his experiences so that other posts and others on the call can hopefully learn from that and move forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Thank you, Albert. Thank you very much. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, Ben, can hear you fine.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm happy to be here today to let everyone have a glimpse at what our Hampton Roads Post had on the docket for 2018 with respect to resiliency. We met at the end of 2017, realizing that we wanted to try to make 2018 a continued step forward in what we are doing on a very ritual annual basis on our resiliency side. And prior to 2018, what we had found ourselves doing were a few lunches and presentations relative to a major hurricane or storm. We wanted to try to expand that to all areas of resiliency and try to get a little bit more interaction with industry and local communities in trying to understand that it's more than just a bad storm coming through. There are other areas that you could focus on and we should be focusing on. Next slide. So a quick little bulleted list on the screen right now shows the diverse makeup that we have with not only our committee here in Hampton Roads, but in our post in general. We are very fortunate to have a very active, very large post with both academia and public representation, in addition to several local planning commission, and we also have the Port Authority here in Hampton Roads. So we have a lot of contributing members who provide their input and insight through our planning of programs throughout the year. Next slide. So on the screen now, slide number 29 is a little timeline graphic that shows how we broke up the month in terms of our emergency preparedness or an infrastructure resilience presentation versus how it would align with the a few of the regional or national events, SAMI events. In March, we had our Critical Infrastructure Summit, and in May, we have our annual JETC conference. But we made sure that we wanted to hit the year strong right in the beginning and try to get as many folks interested in as many areas as possible, knowing the diverse trainings and diverse workshops that are available at the conferences in March and May. So what I'm going to do is on the following slides, I'm going to have a slide for each of the red stars that you see on the screen and discuss a little bit more of 4 programs that we had done. Next slide. So the biggest event that we did in 2018, and one that was very successful and we'll say the widest breadth of influence, was our January program. What we had done in January was we had seen that there was a documentary done by Roger Sorkin named called Tidewater. It was a documentary in Hampton Roads that was done to emphasize the problems and challenges that sea level rise has with mission readiness at the base and with the Port Authority and how it impacts economic commerce. So what we had done was we tried to make this a very, very diverse program where we tried to get each of the groups in our post involved. First, we reached out to our student post at the local ODU, Old Dominion University student post, and we asked if they would be willing to host a screening in their movie theater and auditorium and have a panel discussion afterwards. They agreed to host. We were able to get students involved. We agreed to have a networking event prior to the screening, so where we would be able to have folks to mingle around and sort of introduce themselves if they have come to a lunch. Try to make it a little bit more of a downplayed setting where they can interact. After the screening, we had a panel discussion where we had 3 folks, 2 retired rear admirals and the chief resiliency officer of the city of Norfolk. And we had a 45-minute Q&A session, which was very, very well received. And we had over 150 folks attend the screening. Afterwards, a lot of folks said that they would like to see a screening or a movie platform type event like this more often. So we're going to try to build this into all of our years to come. Next slide. So when the slide loads up here, we have a trailer that I would like to show you from the documentary. It's a 2-minute trailer, so I'll go ahead and let that play. I'm not sure if the sound is playing.
Ben, the sound is not playing. Bell, if you can turn that on, please.
Okay, it looks like the sound is not playing. That's okay. If we're having sound issues, we can skip the trailer. The trailer is available. I can tell folks where to go. If you go to the American Resiliency Project, you'll see that there are a few documentaries that Mr. Sorkin has developed. Tidewater being the one that we had. It is you can get it right from from the webpage, and any other information or screenings of it can be coordinated through that as well if you are interested. Sorry about that. All right, next slide. Okay, next is our February program. So we expanded our resiliency to be energy resilience. So we had a presentation from Frank Miyagwa from Jacobs, and he presented on the planning and design of microgrids. And for those on the call wondering what is a microgrid? A microgrid basically is it's a individual power system that can be detached from the primary grid and can function on its own. So it's almost its own generator. And Frank did a great job explaining the ability to integrate these more and more on military installations. And he explained how the RAM, as he had called it, or the reliability, availability, and maintainability process was run, and the importance of considering what truly is the production availability of your system if you were to assess what failure scenarios could happen, how frequently they happen, and what are the consequences that most typically occur from them. One of the biggest lessons learned from the DoD microgrid analysis was that, surprise, climate and weather conditions are one of the more primary drivers of the success. One good example he had brought up was that in one installation, it had a very effective microgrid that stayed online through a storm. However, the roadway to access it got flooded. So just in fact we had a system that worked well, but we didn't think outside of it where it's not accessible anymore. We have just as much of an issue if we didn't have the power to begin with. So more than just the infrastructure itself, it's more of how it integrates with the environment and the site in general. Next slide. April was a month where we focused on one of our post members who, Michael Darrow with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Norfolk District, was stationed or deployed over in Kabul for around 6 months. And his job was to help look for an engineering solution to enhancing safety in the green zone for Task Force Enhanced Security Zone. So on the slide, I have a roadway network where you'll see a bunch of yellow lines, green lines, and some dashed lines. And the green lines represent the boundaries of what they're calling the green zone. And in May of 2017, there was an IED explosion adjacent to this green zone that killed over 100. So there was a dire need to be resilient in the sense of the infrastructure and the staff and men and women who were in the green zone to be able to do their duties, to perform, be ready for the mission ready, and do it safely. So Michael and his team were tasked with trying to use that engineering problem-solving method for a non-engineering scenario to see how it can be improved. And one really cool aspect of this is that it is a process and a methodology that can be applied in a more grandiose scheme as well. It can be used very easily for an event here if we wanted to have an evacuation, or look at the impacts of say, a disaster and what happened, looking at from a very 30,000 foot high level and bringing it down then more into the intricacies of where we see the vulnerabilities occurring. Next slide. Okay, lastly, we had an October program where we switched over to cybersecurity and looking at the impacts of cybersecurity and operational resilience, as we want to call it. So Mike Messer from ICF came in and presented and did a great job explaining not only the evolution of where we've come of IT and cybersecurity within DoD, but it brought it up in the terms of it's a military, it is a warfighting domain. So it's almost another battlefield nowadays. It's no longer an intricacy that involves a relationship with the actual mission. It is its own mission as well now. And there is just as many mission readiness missions out there to be ready to respond to, not only in the field, but also on the dark web, on the network, on the internet. And there were a lot of great examples that Mike had brought up that explained what kind of protection we have at both a local level and then where we are going out to try to be more, as he had put it, more offense than defense. Instead of waiting for the attack to come, what we're doing to get out there to get ahead of the attacks. So that was a very good presentation that rounded off. So we had a lot of what we had called weather and the typical resilience, energy resilience, and then wrapping up the year with our cybersecurity. Next slide. So after 2018 ended, we reconvened as a committee and we came up with what we wanted to apply going forward, what we saw being very successful, what things we wanted to work on. We saw that the first event in January, getting out into the community, was very successful. So we want to maintain being relevant to our community and getting out there. We want to engage our local resources, our city planners. We got a lot from industry in terms of the innovation that's out there. So we want to continue reaching out to have a robust involvement from the private sector. And one thing we got as an input from our student post at ODU is they said that they had an excellent opportunity to meet several folks that they probably would have been shy or not able to meet if they were at a luncheon and everyone is dressed up and we're in a format where you take your seat, you listen, and then you leave. So it was really good to see that maybe more networking events prior to our resiliency programs would be a great way to make sure we're getting our young members involved and setting the stage for the next level of folks who are going to come up and follow. Next slide. And that was the end of my presentation. I'm going to turn this back over now to Albert. Albert?
Albert, I think you're muted.
I think Albert is muted, but I want to thank everyone for listening to me on my presentation. And if there's any questions, I can be reached at ben, ben.reim, ream, at Kimley, K-I-M-L-E-Y, -horn, HORN.com. And I'll be happy to share any of the materials we develop to advertise our programs or share any insight or pictures or thoughts on our events in more detail.
Hi, Ben. We have a question about the Hampton Roads.
Sure.
Can the Hampton Roads Post speaker talk about the upcoming IGE on sea level rise impact in Hampton Roads?
Yes, so I know, so right now, concurrently with what we're doing within the Post, we do have an IGE committee that is meeting regularly to begin engaging folks on the sea level rise. There's several localities within Hampton Roads that have already started to undertake sea level rise and resilience modeling to see where we're going to be a couple years down the road, where we both have an event that is, we'll say, gray sky and blue sky events. We are actively in the beginning stages of planning that, but it will be involved. I wish I had a little bit more to say what specifically we're doing, but it is going to be accounted for, and we are doing it actively. We actually have 3 folks from our Post on that local IGE committee.
Thanks for that, Ben. Albert, you seem to have control of your microphone. Can you do a test run for us to see if we're back?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but I was unable to get the microphone to work. But thank you very much. And now that you can hear me, just wanted to say thank you to Ben and to Joyce for wonderful presentations. We're coming up. We have maybe another couple minutes for questions. I don't know if we're able to ask any at this point, but there was a question asked from one of the attendees. Can you talk a bit, Ben, about upcoming IGE on sea level rise impacts in Hampton Roads that you guys are looking at? Can you chat about that a little bit?
We actually, I think that question, I think I just addressed that question. We have a